The mission is simple: to help high achievers naturally eliminate emotional and physical obstacles so they can optimize their life for higher achievement. Welcome. You have just entered the Genesis Zone. Good day, and welcome to the Genesis Zone show. I'm Dr. Brian Brown. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. If you're new to the Genesis Zone show, we've been talking about psilocybin for a while now, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. I get asked the question all the time: when do you think psilocybin will be approved and legal? In this episode, I'm going to be sharing an update on the status of psilocybin's approval by the FDA and when we can expect it to hit mainstream use. Again, for those who may be new to the Genesis Zone community, we've been discussing psychedelic therapies in general for quite some time. Of particular interest to my fans is the topic of psilocybin, and I'll explain what that is in a minute if you're not familiar with that. And also of interest around psilocybin is this whole thing of when it will be available for legal use. And the interest around psilocybin actually supersedes interest around ketamine, which is another psychedelic in the anesthesia drug realm, but it's also a psychedelic that we use in psychedelic assisted therapy and have for years now. Hands down, I get more questions on my podcast episodes regarding psilocybin than I do episodes from any of the other psychedelics. The most common question I get, as I said at the top of the show, is when will it be available legally? Now, this is a great question, and it comes up so much lately that I've decided to dedicate an entire episode to answering this very question. If you're new to the therapeutic psychedelic world, there are a lot of studies currently underway and ones that have already been completed with the use of psychedelics in mental health care, with substances such as psilocybin, ketamine, MDMA, DMT, lysergic acid or LSD, ayahuasca, peyote, and ibogaine. For the sake of sticking to the topic, I'm only going to talk about psilocybin. Now, psilocybin is the active compound in certain strains of mushrooms. You might have heard of it called magic mushrooms or psychedelic mushrooms. And it's been used for centuries in various cultures for spiritual and healing purposes. But it's this very historical context that provides us the perfect backdrop for modern investigations into the compound's therapeutic potential. Now, the interest in psilocybin and other psychedelics for their potential therapeutic properties and their effects on human consciousness started in the mid-20th century. In 1957, R. Gordon Wasson, the vice president of J.P. Morgan and Company, published an article in Life magazine titled "Seeking the Magic Mushroom," which detailed his experiences with psilocybin mushrooms in a ritualistic setting in Mexico. Now, this article is credited with introducing psilocybin to the wide Western culture audience. In 1958, Dr. Albert Hofmann, a Swiss chemist who first synthesized LSD or lysergic acid, successfully isolated and identified the structures of psilocybin and psilocin within mushroom compounds. He also synthesized psilocybin in the laboratory. Now, Hoffman worked at the pharmaceutical company Sandoz, which began producing synthetic psilocybin under the name psilocybin for experimental and medical purposes. Late in the 1950s and in the early 1960s, researchers started conducting formal studies on the effects of psilocybin on consciousness, perception, behavior, and its potential therapeutic applications. Now, notable figures in this research community included Dr. Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, Alpert, later known as Ram Dass at Harvard University. Their work, known as the Harvard Psilocybin Project, involved administering psilocybin, believe it or not, to graduate students and observing its effects on human behavior and consciousness. However, their controversial methods and the increasing recreational use of psychedelics led to the cessation of the project at Harvard. In the late 1960s, psilocybin was also studied for various potential therapeutic applications, such as treating alcoholism, anxiety, and depression. However, again, the political and social climate of the late 1960s, early 70s, characterized by a counterculture movement and concerns about uncontrolled use of psychedelics, led to increased regulations from the federal government. As a result, by the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s, research into psychedelics, including psilocybin, was largely halted, or at minimum was pushed completely underground away from the watchful eye of regulators. Many of the people who are in this community today have associations with or were a part of that underground community back in the 60s and 70s, when it was it became highly regulated and was pushed into the underground area. Now, fast forward to the 21st century, where we are today, and interest in psilocybin as a therapeutic agent has resurged. Numerous modern studies have been exploring its potential for treating a range of conditions, including depression, anxiety associated with terminal illnesses, substance abuse and addiction, as well as post-traumatic stress disorder. Now that you have a grasp on where we've come from, let's talk about the legal process of getting a compound like psilocybin approved by the FDA for clinical use. Now, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA for short, has established a systematic process to ensure that drugs are safe and effective before they reach the general public. Now, this process involves several phases of clinical trials, and here's a breakdown of these phases. Now, initially, a compound undergoes preclinical testing. Now, these are simply laboratory tests before they are allowed to be tested on humans. And in some cases, unfortunately, they use animals for these tests, but they're testing to see whether it's safe and effective in a laboratory type setting. During this step of the investigation of a new compound, if things look okay in the laboratory setting, an application is made to the FDA called an investigational new drug application, or an IND application. If the drug shows promise in these preclinical trials, then the investigational new drug application is submitted, and depending on what the results were in those laboratory settings, the FDA decides whether or not they're going to approve the compound for further research. Next, if it is approved in the IND, investigational new drug application, it moves to phase 1, which is safety testing. This involves a small number of healthy volunteers, usually 20 to 100 volunteers. And the main goal is to evaluate safety and determine safe dosage ranges and identify potential side effects. Now, the trial assesses how the drug is metabolized and excreted as well. The next phase is phase 2. This is the efficacy and side effect trial. Now, this involves a larger group of participants or volunteers, usually anywhere from 100 to 300 in number, who have conditions that the drug is intended to treat. Now, the main goal here is to further evaluate the safety and determine whether the drug has a therapeutic effect window and what that therapeutic effect window is, and also explore any possible side effects that could come up. Then, once it passes those clinical trials, the FDA then allows it to go into phase 3, and this is confirmatory testing. Now, this is a very large study with around 1,000 to 3,000 participants in randomized blinded trials. Now, the main goal is to confirm the drug's effectiveness, compare it to existing treatments, and monitor side effects in diverse populations over longer periods of time. This is usually the longest phase of all of the clinical trials, except for when you get to phase 4, and I'll explain that in a minute. If the drug successfully completes this phase, phase 3, and shows a favorable risk-benefit profile, the manufacturer of the compound can submit an NDA, or a new drug application, to the FDA. Now, the NDA, or new drug application, goes under review at that point. And once the FDA receives the application, they review all the submitted data and make a decision about whether the drug can be sold to the public. If it's approved, the drug becomes available for use in prescribing and clinical practice at that point. And then we roll into phase 4 clinical trials. Outside of the actual leading up to FDA approval, phase 3 is the longest phase. Phase 4 is the ongoing phase for the life of the drug. Now, this phase happens after a drug is approved and is available to the public. Manufacturers are required to report any adverse reactions or problems to the FDA. You may have heard of some drugs through the years that are in this phase 4 clinical trial, and for whatever reason, because the FDA has been alerted to a pattern of reported incidences, either A, the drug gets pulled from the market, or B, the package insert, the directions for health providers, is modified so that they're aware of these new issues. Now, this phase allows for the detection of rare and long-term effects in a broader population, and could lead to a drug being removed from the market, as I said a second ago. Now, each phase of the clinical trial process is crucial for ensuring that a compound is safe and effective for human consumption. The process is rigorous, exhaustive, and oftentimes time-consuming, but it ensures that when a drug is approved, its benefits outweigh the potential risk for the intended population, or at least that's the hope. So where do we stand with psilocybin? What phase is it in? The short answer is that we have received a fast track designation status, and I'll explain that here in just a second. Preliminary research early on with psilocybin, the initial studies through phase 2, the initial studies all the way up through phase 2, along with anecdotal evidence, suggested that psilocybin might be beneficial for conditions like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and substance use disorders. So in 2018 and in 2019, the FDA granted breakthrough therapy designation to psilocybin. Now, this is the fast track that I'm talking about. So in 2018, 2019, breakthrough therapy designation came to psilocybin for major depressive disorder in 2018 and treatment-resistant depression in 2019. Now, this designation helped to expedite the drug's development and review process due to its potential to address unmet medical needs. In other words, because of this designation of breakthrough therapy status, when a researcher submits a study, that study gets moved to the top of the FDA's pile so that they can review it more quickly and hopefully get this process pushed through so that we can get this on the market faster. That's what that means. Controlled clinical trials have been conducted by organizations like the MAPS program, which stands for Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelics. Also, organizations like the USANA Institute and Compass Pathways have initiated rigorous controlled clinical trials to determine the safety and efficacy of psilocybin-assisted therapy. Now, positive results from these trials are necessary for FDA approval, and so far, the data have been extremely positive. Thanks to these organizations like MAPS, USANA, and Compass, and their university affiliations with researchers around the world, psilocybin sailed through phase 1 clinical trials like a champ. They entered into phase 2 fairly rapidly, and preliminary studies demonstrated the potential of psilocybin to treat conditions like treatment-resistant depression. Now, notably, Compass Pathways, the mental health care company, conducted a phase 2B trial of psilocybin therapy for treatment-resistant depression, and positive outcomes from these studies contributed to the FDA's decision to grant psilocybin that breakthrough therapy designation that I talked about a second ago. In late 2022, psilocybin entered phase 3 clinical trials. And as of 2022, Compass Pathways had initiated those phase 3 clinical trials of psilocybin therapy for the treatment-resistant depression that had been granted breakthrough status. These trials have helped gather more extensive data on the efficacy, safety, and optimal dosage of psilocybin. Now, the result of these phase 3 trials have been crucial for determining whether psilocybin will receive FDA approval for therapeutic use. Everything is going so well that it appears psilocybin will enter final phase 4 clinical trials sometime in either late 2024 or early 2025. That's my prediction. Recall that phase 4 happens after a drug is approved. So what I'm saying is, I think it's going to be approved to enter phase 4, which is open public consumer usage in the medical community, open prescribing by providers, sometime in late 2024, early 2025. Now, MDMA, as I discussed a few episodes ago, is going to be approved in early 2024, in the first half of 2024. And we're going to have that in no time. So our armament is actually growing with psychedelic tools, okay? And the use in mental health and in psychiatry. We've got ketamine, MDMA is coming out right now. And then sometime in late 2024, early 2025, psilocybin will come out. Okay. So conservatively, my prediction is, as I said, at the latest, early 2025, psilocybin is going to be approved and legalized across the board in every state for use in clinical psychiatric practice. If you're battling with depression or anxiety or panic, post-traumatic stress disorder, you need to know you're not alone. And while we're waiting for the dust to settle and all of these new therapies to come online, there are answers and solutions to what you can do to treat these. In fact, in our protocol, we are actually combining psychedelic assisted psychotherapy with what I'm about to share with you. And it is an extremely rapid way, even if you don't do the psychedelic assisted therapy, which I hope everybody has the opportunity to do. But even if you don't do that, getting your genetics fixed is essential. Here's why. Because when we do the psychedelic work, we are changing the neurochemistry in the brain. And that's a good thing when neurochemistry is out of balance. But we have to ask the golden question, why is that neurochemistry out of balance? And it goes back to our genetics. Yes, it can be because of stressful events that we've lived through, but it can also be from stressors that our ancestors have passed down to us. And we've talked about those studies here on the Genesis Zone show, where for at least 7 generations, we know that things like anxiety and depression can be passed down generation to generation. And I just call that generational energy. Yes, it does have a genetic link, but it's also an energetic problem as well. But we can modify that by nutritionally supporting the gene to function at its highest capability. Now, how do we do that? We do a simple cheek swab. We send that into the lab, and usually within a week or two, we have results back, and we're able to determine, okay, this particular genetic switch is a good switch, but it's turned off, and we need to turn that on. So what can we do to support that good gene so that the switch is no longer turned off and it's turned on? And then the opposite of that is true. When we look at that genetic profile, we see, oh, well, you've got the deck stacked against you, so to speak, because you've got a lot of bad switches that are turned on. And our goal is to get those bad switches turned off. And we can nutritionally support that gene to turn that switch off, just like we can nutritionally support a good gene to turn on. If that doesn't make sense, message me privately. I'll be glad to explain that in greater detail. But that's the gist of why checking genetics And specifically, if you struggle with depression, anxiety, panic, or post-traumatic stress disorder, or addiction issues, or ADHD, it's really critical to understand the genetic landscape so that we can lay that foundation of nutritionally supporting your genes so that when we do things like psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, those changes stay because of the neuroplastic changes that the psychedelics are bringing about, all those positive changes in the brain. Those changes are staying, and they're setting healthy patterns from that point forward. So again, if you have any questions about that, feel free to message me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter at Dr. Brian G. Brown. That's at Dr. Brian G. Brown. And I'll be glad to answer any questions that you've got. And if you're that self-starter type, the person who likes to kind of take the bull by the horns, and you just want to learn more about DNA profiling and what it means to you, I've created a boot camp. It's free. You can go to drbriangibrown.com/gene hack/boot camp, and you can download the boot camp right there. You can work at it at your own pace, and it'll explain everything that you need to know about your genetics, because I have a proprietary questionnaire that I use in that particular course, that little boot camp, that will help you understand these are the genetic areas I probably need to focus on first. And you may be surprised. We have people that come in all the time with PTSD, substance use, depression, anxiety, ADHD, and we have them do this questionnaire, a longer version in the office, actually a little more detailed. But they do this detailed questionnaire. We're able to map out exactly where we need to focus once we get the genetic results back. And hands down, it makes all the difference in the world of being able to rapidly move to the heart of the problem. But it's not unusual for you to have issues outside of your brain, which is where you think you may have problems if you're struggling with mental health issues, because the 5 zones are brain, body, sleep, energy, and immune. You may have an immune issue that is affecting genetically an immune issue that's affecting everything that's going on with you. And we support that immune system to function at a higher level. And before you know it, you're feeling better. Your depression's resolving. Your anxiety is resolving. So that's all I've got for today. Tune in next Thursday at noon Eastern Standard Time for our next In the Zone segment, where I'll be talking to you about how to optimize yourself physically and emotionally on this journey that we call life. This journey that has a tendency for a lot of people to be a really stressful journey. And guess what? It doesn't need to be a stressful journey, because we can navigate through this life physically and emotionally at a higher level, a higher vibrational level, simply by doing some basic, well, not so basic, maybe some advanced things that are becoming more mainstreamed in the functional community, functional medicine community. And if you haven't, like I said, if you have any questions about it, feel free to reach out to me. Don't hesitate. Most informed, most trusted, and most grateful you spent this time with us today. Until next time, stay in the zone. I'm Dr. Brian Brown.